Welcome to the most disappointing games of 2023. Just for clarity, before you all burn me alive with your pitchforks, torchlights and, well, other apparatus, disappointing means I had expectations for these games and they fell short, well short, or a million miles off. With that being said, let's get into my 5 most disappointing games of 2023. Subliminal message, subscribe. Number 5 is Forspoken. The reason it's low on this list is because actually my expectations weren't great once I'd played the demo. I still had hope. It's a Square Enix game, it's a new IP, and the world looked beautiful. It used the old Final Fantasy 15 engine, so there was hope there. What transpired though was a truly mundane, vapid open world with terrible, spammy combat, bland environments, an awful main character, poorly written script, dialogue and story, and honestly it's one of the worst games I've played in the last few years, never mind just the last year. Number 4 goes to Jedi Survivor. Now that's for 2 reasons. One is the awful launch, which is unacceptable. A game that is a Star Wars game using the IP released in that state is just not right. It's not right on any game, it's even more wrong on a Star Wars game. But also, the main criticism I have of Star Wars, it all just felt a touch flat, which is some feat when you're using the Star Wars IP. I felt the combat felt way too floaty and not impactful enough. The storyline, the core concept of the storyline, it just didn't get my blood flowing. I did like the characters you meet along the way, and of course the main character is very likable, but the world, even the platforming wasn't great. It just felt very limited, it felt very rigid. It just didn't quite live up to the expectations of what I would want from a modern next-gen Star Wars game. It has some memorable set-piece moments, as well as nods of course to classic Star Wars material and classic Star Wars moments. But all in all, I just don't think Jedi Survivor did enough to grip me by the collar and drag me through this story. I found the platforming sections to be heavily overused, and by the end of the game, quite frankly, very boring. And the general lack of meaningful rewards from exploration was something else that bothered me. It may be that you actually didn't mind finding cosmetics or different parts of your lightsaber by exploring, but I like more tangible upgrades to my character. I like a real reason to go out there and explore every nook and cranny of a map. And for me, a different coloured cape wasn't that. By no means is Jedi Survivor a poor game, but it also isn't a great game, and that's what made it so disappointing. Number 3 is Armored Core 6. Yes, FromSoft fanboys, bring it. Now look, I love FromSoft games, I've said many times, Bloodborne, Sekiro, 2 of my favourite games of all time. Armored Core 6 though, I understand it's not a Souls game. However, there's a variety of things I just don't think it does very well. First of all, world design. I mean, it's very bland. Everything's just a couple of buildings here and there, vast empty spaces. Okay, I know you're on Rubicon and it's on this big vast world, but I don't know. If that was the only issue, I'd be able to overlook it. But it's got other issues as well. First and foremost, the way it doesn't really tell you core mechanics and key mechanics to the combat system. I don't feel the controls are very tight, especially in Armored Core versus Armored Core combat. When the enemies are a lot bigger, such as the huge bosses, it's a lot easier to make your shots and to be able to get your aim. But when you're playing against enemies that move fast, it's not the easiest thing in the world. I've got other issues with build variety and specific builds being good for specific combat encounters, but then you having to change your build halfway through to then find a build for that encounter. Normally not a problem, but then you have to go back to a menu and do it, etc., or wait for it to give you a chance to reset. But on the other hand, I thought the story was fantastic. Yes, it's delivered in a very basic manner, but what they're saying here and the kind of relationships between the different mercenary groups, I found it fascinating and was really the biggest surprise of Armored Core 6. The main gripe I had is a lot of the Armored Core versus Armored Core combat didn't really feel like it was my skill that was defeating them. It just kind of felt like a bit of a spam fest. But that wasn't the case for the bigger boss fights, where I really felt like they were a real skill check and I enjoyed defeating them and I felt fantastic after defeating them. But I don't know, when you see FromSoft, you think of a new release of a game by From Software, I expect better overall. I expect better worlds, I expect better combat, and I expect the story to be delivered in a bit of a better way than just, you know, listening to what is, to be honest, just a radio. Generally, the mission structures leave a lot to be desired. I'm not really a fan of just loading into a mission, going from A to B and just getting out of the mission, unless the world you load into is really captivating. And sadly, that just isn't the case here. But again, before people think I think it's a bad game, I don't think Armored Core is a bad game. It just has way too many areas where it just doesn't feel good enough for the company that made it and for the IP itself. Number 2 is Atomic Heart. Oh, Atomic Heart, how you broke my heart. I was really excited for Atomic Heart. I love Soviet era, communist era games, anything with that whole theme going on. Post-apocalyptic robot world, whatever you want to call it. And what we got instead was a terribly designed game. The gameplay features, the quality of life features, whether it's the ammo crafting, the skill availabilities, the ability to change items or craft ammo stations, the boss fights, my god, the boss fights, the melee combat, the knockdown system. Oh god, it was a mess. My god, the actual gameplay elements of Atomic Heart were a mess. The world was beautiful. The art direction in some of the areas gorgeous, and the music was utterly fantastic. In fact, the music was the best feature of Atomic Heart. Everything else, I mean, just playing this game was a chore. The open world is terrible. Respawning enemies who just get rebuilt instantly. Not enough ammo to keep up with the rate at which the enemies respawn. The way the open world, you just have to run past everything because you don't want to waste your ammo on the constantly respawning enemies. The lore in the game was actually decent, explaining to you what happened in this world when the robots took over. The way you get that information from NPCs and dead bodies around the world. But honestly, the gameplay was so bad. My god, I despised Atomic Heart. And in at number 1, we have the easiest number 1 I will give in any list ever, and that is Final Fantasy 16. What an absolute mess of a game. Before you all start attacking me in the comments, I'm going to break down to you exactly why Final Fantasy 16 is so disappointing. I refuse to believe a video game can have a playtime of roughly 50 hours. 11 of those hours are cutscenes. About 10 of those hours, and I'm being very generous with those 10 hours, are excellent combat situations, boss fights, and set piece events. And the remaining 30 hours or so have the worst mission design, structure, and storytelling in a Final Fantasy game that I have played. Now, I have no issue with the game being influenced by a movie, TV series, or director. However, this is a character-for-character, verbatim recreation of Game of Thrones, to the point that it just gets embarrassing. And then we have the hours upon hours of exposition dumps that don't even really say anything, battles that are so monotonous, a combat system which looks great, doesn't have enough depth to it whatsoever, and a world that really flatters to deceive. Vast, open, empty fields of blandness. Now, don't get me wrong, that 10 hours of boss fights and big set piece events are incredible, wonderful. Some of the best stuff you'll see in isolation this year. And I have to give a nod to the political intrigue of Final Fantasy 16. I personally really enjoyed it. Sadly, all of it becomes kind of irrelevant later on down the line and renders what you've been told about the world and the politics and the disinformation going on between the different political groups and different countries and states. It renders it all useless and it renders it all pointless later on. The ending is a damp squib by the very obvious and quite telegraphed ending, and ultimately it's all a huge disappointment. The reason it's number 1 is because the hype around Final Fantasy 16 was huge. I'm actually somebody who's very vocal about developers being brave and changing things about their games and trying new things. It may not always work, but as long as you can pull it off to some level, then I respect that and I respect that effort. Here, they've gone for a more action-based Final Fantasy and decided that that change means that everything else can be bang average. Actually, I think the combat could have worked if the story, the level design, and the mission structure was so much better. It actually would have been a much better game. In fact, it would have been a much better game if they cut about 20 hours out of this game, which actually has just reminded me of the terrible pacing. Another awful thing in Final Fantasy 16 is the shocking pacing. You're going from these incredible fights to collecting someone's dishwater, and then there's just the really bizarre decisions. It's almost as if they wanted to make Final Fantasy 16 accessible to new players, but made it so accessible that it's It just feels like there's nothing there. QTEs, they give you about 3 hours to input your QTE selection. Why even bother having it there? I mean, while I'm ranting, I might as well go into mission structure. You will go from circular or rectangular room to another circular or rectangular room, kill 2 waves of enemies, and then move on. And it'll be the same enemies in both rooms. And what makes it worse is because the combats just simply wait for your cooldowns to come off, spam your abilities, then wait for your cooldowns to come off. It just makes the repetitiveness of the mission structure even worse. And then pouring more fuel on the dumpster fire that is the mission structure and combat is a lack of builds available. There's no gearing, there's no RPG elements, there's nothing like that where you can build around skills and build around play styles. Oh my god, I could go on forever. This video's gone on way too long already. It's almost as if they wanted to be beginner friendly but then took all the soul out of Final Fantasy. I mean, I'm still very angry about Final Fantasy 16. I bought the special edition, I bought the Steelbook edition, and it was an absolute flop. I don't know what else to say. And that is my top 5 most disappointing games of 2023. Feel free to leave a comment with your own top 5 list. What were your most disappointing games, and give us some quick reasons why. I would love to hear what other people's top 5s are. And yeah, let me know what you thought of my list as well. Thank you very much, take care, and we will have top 5 games of the year coming very, very soon.